So how can we handle form validation with help of Angular? Well, when using this template-driven approach, so when using ng model to register controls in the end, you can add special validation directives or attributes to your input elements. And some of these attributes are standard attributes you could add to vanilla HTML elements as well. Like, for example, the required attribute. I'll actually add it after ngModel here, but the position doesn't matter. You could add that to a standard HTML element that's not managed by Angular as well, and you would get some browser built-in validation. But when using it on an element that is registered with ngModel, Angular will actually take over and disable the browser built-in validation and instead validate it itself internally. Because required is essentially registered as a directive with Angular, you could say, and when used on an element that also uses ngModel, Angular under the hood will check whether a value has been entered into this input field. Because required simply tells Angular that this input field must not be empty. So Angular will check for that and will tell you if that's not the case. And I'll show you how it tells you in just a second. We can also add required here on the password input. Now, in addition, this input should also be an email address, and that's why we can add the special email directive to this input, or email attribute, if you want to call it like this. But that's also registered as a directive by Angular in the end. And it will in the end check whether a valid email address has been entered here. For the password input, I want to make sure that it's at least 6 characters long, and we can do that by adding the min length attribute here and setting this to 6. And that's then also registered by Angular. So these are some of the most common directives you can add to add validation or to enforce validation with help of Angular. And there also would be others like max if you wanted to allow a maximum number in an input, or min if you want to ensure that no number lower than this min number can be entered in case you have some kind of numeric input. There also is max length if you care about the max length. And pattern if you want to register your own regular expression pattern that should be used for validation. Now here I only want to use these validation directives here though. And if I add them and save everything, you'll notice that I can still submit an empty form. Because that's really important to understand. Adding these validation attributes, these validation directives here, does not tell Angular that it should prevent form submission or anything like that. Instead, it will just change some internally managed values. And therefore, back in the login component, I will console log this form object, which we get, which is managed by Angular, to see what changed there. Because now if I submit that empty form, I got this form group object here again. And if we expand that, we can now see that in there, the status, for example, is invalid. And if I go to the controls, I see that, for example, for the email control, the status is invalid. And I can see that there I got an errors key, which now holds an object where required is set to true, which in the end tells me that it's the required validator that failed here. So that was not met. If I, for example, enter something that's not an email address and I submit this, I see that still the overall form status is invalid. But now for the email control, errors is email true. Because now the required validator was met. It's not an empty input field after all, but it's not an email address. So the email validator basically told Angular that this email control is invalid. So this is what changes if we add those validation attributes and directives here. And we can therefore use this information, for example, when the form is submitted. Here, right at the start, I can check if form data form valid, if that is true. Because the overall form does have a valid property, which is false here if it is invalid. So I can check if this overall form is valid, or to be precise, if it's not valid, or alternatively, there actually also is an invalid property which I can simply check. And if this form is invalid, then I can, for example, just return. To make sure that none of this code will execute if an invalid form has been submitted, which will essentially make sure that nothing happens if an invalid form was submitted. That's one thing we might want to do. But we can also do more than just that. Now, getting this information that the form is invalid is nice, but of course it would be nicer if we could also show the user some error message if an invalid form was submitted. And therefore, what we might want to do here is go back to our template, and then maybe below this div here, we could add a paragraph with a class of control-error, which is a class I prepared in advance, a CSS class. And we might want to output some error message here. We could, for example, say, invalid values detected. Please check your input. We can then add a if check and check if form.form. So now I'm using this form template variable, which has a nested form object, as you saw before in the TypeScript code. And I can check if that is invalid. And in that case, I will show this error message. I'll output this paragraph with this error message. So if I save that, I can see this error message here. And it will go away if I do enter valid values in both inputs, as you can tell. But of course I see it right from the start, which is not the best possible user experience because the user didn't have any chance of changing that input. So what we might want to do instead is use some other piece of information and make our if check a bit more complex. I don't just want to check whether the form is invalid, I also want to check if touched is true, which means the user did at least touch one input. This will make sure that initially the error message is not visible, and only if I at least selected one input and deselected it, this error message will appear. It's still not perfect, but better, therefore. Of course, it would be better if we would make sure that both inputs have been touched. So we might want to access form.form controls email touched, and also ensure that the password control has been touched. And now this is getting a bit more complex here, and I'll soon show you how to make it simpler. We are also getting an error because Angular is not convinced here that this email property exists. Instead, you should use a slightly different way of accessing it, as this error message also tells you. Like this. With that, it's still pretty complex, and again, we will improve that soon, but it should do its job now. With that, I check whether both the email and password have at least been touched, so the user at least tried to enter something valid, and if the form then still is invalid. Nonetheless, if I try to run this code, you'll see that I get an error here. That in the end, we can't read from an undefined value when trying to access this touched property on a control. The reason for that is that when using this template-driven approach, this entire Angular form object isn't available the first time this template is being rendered. Instead, this template defines the form structure, so it's only available thereafter. So if I try to access some control-specific information inside of the template, that won't work because the first time it's being rendered, that form won't have been set up yet, and the controls won't have been registered yet. Therefore, this approach actually won't work here, but that's also no problem because it was a bit too verbose anyways. Instead, we can use a more efficient way of accessing control-specific information in the template, as I want to do it here. What we can do when using the template-driven approach, if we want to get information about one of our controls, is we can add a template variable to that control, like email or email CTRL for email control, whatever you want to do here. I'll just go for email. And then, if you would add it like this, you would again get access to the underlying DOM object, which is not what I want here. Instead, I want to get access to this control object that's created by Angular. And I can get hold of that by again using this special syntax we saw up here, but now it's not equals ngForm, but equals ngModel. This is some syntax that is supported by the ngModel directive, which in the end tells Angular that we want to store this control object that's created under the hood by Angular for this input in this email template variable. And if I hover over email, I see that it's now of type ngModel, which in the end is this form control type. And we can do the same for the password and give this a template variable named password, which is equal to ngModel. With that down here in this if check, we can now use these variables, email for example, and there we also got touched as one possible field we can get access to. Because in the end here we can now get access to those control-specific properties, and now with that, the error does go away and this does run. So that's the easier way and the working way here of getting access to control-specific information inside of your template. With that, if we go back, you'll see that if I tap into the email and I tap out of it, nothing happens. But if I then also tap into the password field and I tap out of it, this error message appears. Because now I did touch both inputs and the form is invalid thereafter. And that's exactly what we're checking for here. And that's the kind of information we can get and use when using this template-driven forms approach. We get this form-specific information, the overall form value and whether the form is valid or invalid, and we can get this control-specific information either through this form or, as required here in the template, through these special variables we can add here. And in the login component, we can extract and use that information as you learned it before. And that's therefore another important step forward.